Ever feel like you're one mistake away from being found out? Like your success is just luck, and any moment, the world will realize you don't actually belong? You're not alone. And from self-doubt to self-belief, we pull back the curtain on imposter syndrome, the silent dream killer that holds back even the most talented professionals, students, and creatives. Whether you're a young graduate terrified of your first real job, a mid-career professional paralyzed by promotion anxiety, or an accomplished expert who still feels like a fraud, this isn't just another pep talk. Grounded in neuroscience and packed with real-world strategies, this audiobook gives you the tools to recognize your inner critic's lies, transform failure into fuel, and build unshakable confidence that's earned, not faked. Press play to start replacing that voice whispering "you're not good enough" with proof that you're better than you think, and learn why so many people you admire have battled these same fears. Your seat at the table isn't by accident. It's time to claim it. Chapter 1. What is imposter syndrome? The hidden battle within every achiever. Imposter syndrome is that relentless psychological phenomenon where accomplished individuals remain convinced they don't deserve their success, living with a constant fear of being exposed as frauds despite overwhelming evidence of their competence. This internal experience creates a painful paradox where external validation and achievements fail to translate into genuine self-confidence, leaving sufferers feeling like intellectual imposters who have somehow deceived others into overestimating their abilities. The term was first coined in 1978 by psychologists Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Imes after studying high-achieving women who struggled to internalize their accomplishments. But subsequent research has revealed this phenomenon transcends gender, culture, and profession, affecting approximately 70% of people at some point in their lives. What makes imposter syndrome particularly insidious is how it disproportionately targets high performers. The more competent and accomplished someone is, the more vulnerable they often are to these feelings of inadequacy, because their expanded knowledge makes them acutely aware of how much they don't know. The psychological mechanics behind imposter syndrome reveal why it feels so viscerally real to those experiencing it. Our brains are wired with a negativity bias that causes us to weigh failures more heavily than successes, remember criticism more vividly than praise, and fixate on what we haven't mastered rather than what we have. This evolutionary adaptation that once helped our ancestors survive threats in the wilderness now misfires in modern professional environments, turning normal self-doubt into paralyzing fear of exposure. Neuroscientific research shows that when imposter feelings arise, they activate the same threat response regions of the brain as physical danger, triggering genuine stress responses that make the fear feel undeniable and true, even when objective evidence contradicts it. The syndrome thrives on cognitive distortions like perfectionism, believing anything less than flawless is failure, discounting positives, explaining away achievements as luck, and mind reading, assuming others are judging you harshly. What's particularly fascinating about imposter syndrome is how it manifests differently across personality types. Some sufferers become workaholics, over-preparing and over-delivering to prove their worth. Others develop avoidance behaviors, turning down opportunities to prevent potential failure. Many engage in chronic self-deprecation as a preemptive defense against imagined future exposure. These coping mechanisms often backfire, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where the exhaustion from overworking or the missed opportunities from avoidance actually do limit performance, thereby reinforcing the original false belief of inadequacy. The rise of social media has dramatically amplified imposter syndrome in the digital age, as we're constantly bombarded with curated highlight reels of others' successes while being hyper-aware of our own behind-the-scenes struggles and setbacks, creating an illusion that everyone else is effortlessly thriving while we're barely keeping up. Historical examples of imposter syndrome reveal just how universal and persistent this experience is across fields and eras. Albert Einstein referred to his own work as unnecessary speculation. Years after developing the theory of relativity, Maya Angelou feared each new book would reveal her as a fraud despite her Pulitzer Prize nominations. Even after winning multiple Oscars, Tom Hanks has spoken about waiting for the movie police to show up and revoke his credentials. These examples demonstrate that imposter syndrome has nothing to do with actual competence and everything to do with self-perception, the inability to accurately assess one's own abilities and integrate evidence of success into one's self-concept. The common thread among high achievers who experience imposter syndrome is that they judge themselves by their intentions and doubts while judging others by their actions and accomplishments. creating an unfair double standard they wouldn't apply to anyone else. Breaking free from imposter syndrome begins with recognizing it for what it is, not a reflection of reality but a trick of perception, not a personal failing but a common human experience. The first crucial step is developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thoughts and recognize imposter feelings as passing mental events rather than absolute truths. Cognitive behavioral techniques can help restructure distorted thinking patterns, such as keeping an evidence file of accomplishments and positive feedback to consult when doubts arise, or practicing self-compassion by asking how you would reassure a friend who expressed similar doubts about their abilities. Many find it helpful to reframe competence as a dynamic process rather than a fixed state, understanding that everyone is continuously learning and that gaps in knowledge don't indicate fraudulence but rather the normal trajectory of growth. The workplace implications of imposter syndrome are profound and costly. It leads to burnout from overpreparation, stifles innovation when people don't voice ideas for fear they're not good enough, and creates unnecessary stress that diminishes performance and job satisfaction. Organizations can mitigate these effects by fostering cultures where vulnerability is normalized, where leaders share their own struggles with self-doubt, and where feedback emphasizes effort and growth rather than fixed notions of talent. Mentorship programs are particularly valuable for combating imposter syndrome, as they provide reality checks when protégés' self-assessments diverge dramatically from how others perceive them, helping to bridge the gap between internal doubt and external reality. Ultimately, overcoming imposter syndrome isn't about eliminating self-doubt completely. That's neither possible nor desirable, as appropriate self-questioning drives growth and prevents arrogance. The goal is to reach a balanced perspective where you can acknowledge your limitations without denying your capabilities, where you can accept praise without suspicion, and where you can pursue excellence without being tyrannized by perfectionism. This middle path allows you to benefit from constructive self-criticism while being shielded from the paralyzing effects of imposter fears. With consistent practice, you can retrain your brain to register successes as vividly as it does failures, to internalize positive feedback as readily as it does criticism, and to interpret challenges as opportunities rather than threats of exposure. The journey from imposter syndrome to healthy self-confidence is neither linear nor quick, but each small victory against self-doubt builds psychological resilience that makes the next challenge easier to face. What begins as conscious effort to dispute irrational thoughts gradually becomes automatic, until one day you realize you've developed what psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset. The understanding that abilities can be developed through dedication rather than being fixed traits you either have or lack. This mindset shift is the antidote to imposter syndrome, transforming your relationship with failure from something to be feared into valuable feedback for improvement. As you progress, you'll find yourself spending less energy managing self-doubt and more energy channeling your skills toward meaningful goals, not because you've become perfect, but because you've made peace with being perfectly human. Chapter 2. Why do we doubt ourselves? The roots of imposter phenomenon. The origins of imposter syndrome run deep into the very fabric of human psychology and socialization. Beginning in childhood when our sense of self is first being formed and continuing through adulthood where societal pressures reinforce these early patterns. At its core, imposter syndrome stems from fundamental mismatches between how we perceive ourselves internally versus how we present ourselves externally, creating a psychological divide where we become convinced that the competent persona others see is merely a facade hiding our true, incompetent selves. Developmental psychologists trace these feelings back to early family dynamics where children receive mixed messages about achievement, perhaps being alternately praised for being so smart, while also hearing that you could do better, creating an impossible standard where no accomplishment ever feels truly earned or sufficient. These childhood experiences plant the seeds for what psychologist Carl Rogers called conditions of worth, the belief that our value depends on perfect performance rather than inherent worth as human beings, setting the stage for a lifetime of achievement never quite translating into genuine self-esteem. The education system frequently exacerbates these tendencies through its emphasis on standardized testing and comparative grading, which teaches students to measure their worth through external validation rather than internal growth. Many high achievers develop what psychologist Carol Dweck identified as a fixed mindset in these environments. The belief that intelligence and ability are static traits rather than skills that can be developed, making every challenge feel like a test of whether you're really smart enough rather than an opportunity to learn. This creates tremendous performance anxiety where mistakes feel like revelations of inherent limitations rather than the natural byproducts of stretching beyond one's comfort zone. The transition from structured academic environments to more ambiguous professional settings often intensifies imposter feelings. As the clear metrics of grades and test scores are replaced with subjective evaluations where the rules for success seem opaque and constantly shifting, leaving many professionals feeling like they're faking their way through situations where they believe others have some secret mastery they lack. Cultural factors play a significant role in shaping imposter experiences, with research showing that members of underrepresented groups often face compounded imposter feelings due to stereotype threat. The anxiety about confirming negative stereotypes about their social group, women in male-dominated fields, first-generation college students, minorities in predominantly white professions, and people from working-class backgrounds in elite environments frequently report intensified imposter syndrome as they navigate being the only one in their spaces while carrying the additional psychological burden of representing their entire demographic. These intersectional pressures create what psychologist Claude Steele calls identity contingencies, the extra cognitive and emotional taxes paid by those operating in environments where their identity marks them as atypical, forcing them to constantly monitor both their performance and how that performance might be interpreted through the lens of stereotypes. The chronic stress of this dual consciousness drains mental resources that could otherwise be directed toward the task at hand, ironically sometimes impairing the very performance the individual is so anxious about maintaining. Personality traits also predispose certain individuals to imposter syndrome, with perfectionists, highly sensitive people, and those with anxious attachment styles being particularly vulnerable. Perfectionists set impossibly high standards where anything less than flawless feels like failure, while their tendency to discount successes, anyone could have done that, and magnify shortcomings, I should have known that, creates a distorted self-assessment that fuels imposter feelings. Highly sensitive people's deep processing of emotional experiences means they remember criticism more vividly than praise and are more likely to ruminate on moments of perceived inadequacy. Those with anxious attachment styles, often developed in childhood relationships with inconsistent caregivers, bring this relational pattern into their professional lives, constantly seeking reassurance about their performance while simultaneously doubting the validity of any positive feedback they receive. These personality factors interact with environmental pressures to create the perfect storm for imposter syndrome to thrive, where normal self-doubt escalates into persistent fear of exposure. The modern workplace has become a breeding ground for imposter syndrome due to several structural factors including rapid technological change that makes expertise feel temporary, flattened organizational hierarchies that provide less clear progression markers, and the gig economy's erosion of stable professional identities. Knowledge workers face particular challenges as their work becomes more abstract and difficult to measure. When your job involves thinking, creating, and problem-solving rather than producing tangible outputs, it's easier to doubt whether you're really working or contributing. The rise of remote work has added new dimensions to imposter syndrome, with digital communication stripping away contextual cues that help calibrate self-assessment, making it easier to misinterpret neutral feedback as negative and to compare your unedited daily experience with others' polished virtual personas. Professional social media platforms like LinkedIn exacerbate these tendencies by turning career trajectories into highlight reels where everyone appears to be accelerating while you feel stuck, unaware that you're comparing your behind-the-scenes struggles to others' carefully curated personal branding. Neurobiological research reveals that imposter syndrome has distinct neural signatures, with fMRI studies showing heightened activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational assessment, when individuals experience imposter feelings. This neural pattern explains why imposter syndrome feels so viscerally real. The brain is literally in threat mode, prioritizing emotional reactions over logical analysis. Chronic imposter syndrome can lead to elevated cortisol levels that impair cognitive function over time, creating a vicious cycle where the stress about performing actually diminishes performance capacity. The body keeps the score of these psychological patterns through muscle tension, digestive issues, and sleep disturbances that often accompany persistent imposter feelings, demonstrating how deeply embodied this experience becomes when left unaddressed. Understanding these roots helps depersonalize imposter syndrome, recognizing it as the predictable result of particular psychological, social, and neurological factors rather than evidence of your individual inadequacy. This systemic perspective allows for more compassionate self-reflection where you can acknowledge imposter feelings without believing them, understanding their origins without being controlled by them. By tracing how your specific background, personality, and environment have contributed to your imposter experiences, you gain the power to consciously rewrite these patterns rather than being unconsciously governed by them. This foundational awareness prepares you for the work of rebuilding self-assessment on more accurate and compassionate grounds, which we'll explore in subsequent chapters as we move from understanding imposter syndrome to overcoming it through concrete cognitive, behavioral, and relational strategies. Chapter 3. The Lies Your Brain Tells You. Cognitive Distortions Fueling Imposter Syndrome. Our minds are masterful storytellers, weaving narratives about who we are and what we're capable of. But when imposter syndrome takes hold, these stories become laced with deception. The brain constructs elaborate falsehoods that feel indisputably true in the moment, warping our self-perception until we can no longer distinguish between irrational fear and objective reality. These cognitive distortions, systematic errors in thinking, act like funhouse mirrors, reflecting back a grotesquely altered version of ourselves where every strength appears as a fluke and every mistake as damning evidence of inadequacy. Psychologists have identified several hallmark distortions that form the backbone of imposter syndrome, each reinforcing the others in a self-perpetuating cycle of self-doubt that can persist for decades if left unchallenged. One of the most pervasive and damaging distortions is discounting the positive, a mental filter that systematically dismisses any evidence of competence while amplifying every perceived shortcoming. When you receive praise, your brain immediately counters with, "They're just being nice," or "They don't know the real me." Achievements get explained away as luck, timing, or help from others, never as the result of your own skill and effort. This creates an increasingly distorted personal narrative where success doesn't count, but failure defines you, making it impossible to build genuine self-confidence no matter how much external validation you receive. The cruel irony is that the more accomplished you become, the more sophisticated these discounting mechanisms grow. A Nobel laureate might attribute their prize to committee politics while fixating on one critical peer review, just as a straight-A student obsesses over the 1B+ on their transcript while dismissing all their academic honors as meaningless. Closely related is the distortion of overgeneralization, where isolated incidents become sweeping declarations of incompetence. A single mistake in a presentation transforms into, "I'm terrible at public speaking," or one critical comment from a supervisor becomes, "I'm failing at my job." The brain treats these specific moments as revelatory truths while ignoring the vast majority of experiences that contradict them, creating a skewed database of self-assessment where the outliers carry disproportionate weight. This explains why so many high achievers operate with quiet terror. Their mental highlight reel consists primarily of their stumbles and setbacks, while their consistent successes fade into the background as unremarkable or unearned. The distortion grows stronger over time through confirmation bias, as we unconsciously seek out experiences that validate our self-doubt while minimizing or forgetting those that challenge it, effectively building an airtight case against ourselves without realizing we're both prosecutor and false witness in this mental trial. Perhaps the most psychologically costly distortion is mind reading, where we presume to know what others are thinking about us, always assuming it's negative. The colleague who didn't smile in the hallway must be disappointed in your work. The boss who canceled a meeting must be reconsidering your promotion. The audience member who checked their phone during your talk must have found you boring. These imagined judgments feel absolutely real, triggering genuine stress responses even though they exist solely in our interpretation, not in any verified reality. The tragedy of mind reading is that it isolates us, convinced others are secretly doubting us. We withdraw rather than seeking connection that might provide reassuring perspective. We also engage in fortune-telling, predicting future failure with absolute certainty. "I'll embarrass myself in the meeting tomorrow," based not on evidence, but on this ingrained narrative of inadequacy. These distortions create self-fulfilling prophecies, as the anxiety they generate actually impairs performance, confirming the original false belief. Perfectionism operates as both cause and effect of these distortions, setting impossible standards where anything less than flawless feels like failure. The perfectionist's mind divides all outcomes into two categories: perfect, which gets dismissed as the baseline, and imperfect, which gets labeled as proof I'm not good enough. There's no middle ground where good enough is actually enough, No allowance for the universal human reality that everyone makes mistakes and has gaps in their knowledge. This binary thinking becomes increasingly destructive as responsibilities grow, where an entry-level employee might obsess over typos in emails. An executive wastes mental energy agonizing over hypothetical scenarios no one could perfectly predict. The perfectionist mantra, "If I don't absolutely excel at this, I'm a fraud," guarantees chronic dissatisfaction, since no one masters every aspect of their work, especially when venturing into new challenges essential for growth. Underlying all these distortions is the fundamental misinterpretation of competence, where we falsely equate knowing everything with being competent and not knowing something with being fraudulent. This ignores the reality that expertise always exists within specific domains. No one knows everything about their field, let alone outside it. The more we learn, the more we become aware of what we don't know, a phenomenon psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect in reverse. But we misinterpret this expanding awareness of complexity as personal deficiency rather than intellectual growth. We compare our behind-the-scenes experience, full of doubts, false starts, and learning curves, to others' final products, unaware that they too navigated similar struggles we never witnessed. This explains why imposter syndrome often intensifies as we become more expert. Our increasing knowledge reveals the vastness of what we haven't mastered, while we assume our peers possess some comprehensive understanding we lack. These cognitive distortions share a common origin in our brain's evolutionary wiring to prioritize threat detection over accurate assessment. In prehistoric environments, underestimating one's abilities was safer than overestimating them. Better to assume you couldn't take that mammoth than to charge in and get trampled. But in modern professional settings, this survival mechanism backfires, leaving us chronically underestimating our capacities and overestimating risks. The brain treats potential embarrassment with the same urgency as physical danger, flooding our system with stress hormones that make the imposter feelings feel viscerally true even when logically we know better. This explains why purely intellectual understanding of imposter syndrome often fails to alleviate it. We're fighting millennia of neural programming that says self-doubt keeps us safe. The path forward lies not in eliminating these automatic thoughts, an impossible task, but in developing meta-awareness to recognize them as mental events rather than truths, and tools to challenge them with evidence. Cognitive behavioral therapy techniques are particularly effective here, teaching us to examine our thoughts like a scientist would. What's the evidence for this belief? What's the evidence against it? Is there an alternative explanation? How would I view this situation if it happened to someone I respect? This creates psychological distance from the distortions, allowing us to respond rather than react. We compare our behind-the-scenes experience, full of doubts, false starts, and learning curves, to others' final products, unaware that they too navigated similar struggles we never witnessed. This explains why imposter syndrome often intensifies as we become more expert. Our increasing knowledge reveals the vastness of what we haven't mastered, while we assume our peers possess some comprehensive understanding we lack. These cognitive distortions share a common origin in our brain's evolutionary wiring to prioritize threat detection over accurate assessment. In prehistoric environments, underestimating one's abilities was safer than overestimating them. Better to assume you couldn't take that mammoth than to charge in and get trampled. But in modern professional settings, this survival mechanism backfires, leaving us chronically underestimating our capacities and overestimating risks. The brain treats potential embarrassment with the same urgency as physical danger, flooding our system with stress hormones that make the imposter feelings feel viscerally true even when logically we know better. This explains why purely intellectual understanding of imposter syndrome often fails to alleviate it. We're fighting millennia of neural programming that says self-doubt keeps us safe. The path forward lies not in eliminating these automatic thoughts, an impossible task, but in developing meta-awareness to recognize them as mental events rather than truths, and tools to challenge them with evidence. Cognitive behavioral therapy techniques are particularly effective here, teaching us to examine our thoughts like a scientist would. What's the evidence for this belief? What's the evidence against it? Is there an alternative explanation? How would I view this situation if it happened to someone I respect? This creates psychological distance from the distortions, allowing us to respond rather than react. Over time, we can cultivate what psychologist Lisa Orboston calls balanced self-awareness, honest acknowledgement of both strengths and growth areas without tipping into self-flagellation or grandiosity. The goal isn't to never doubt yourself, but to prevent those doubts from dictating your choices and self-concept. Understanding these cognitive distortions as universal mental habits rather than personal failings is profoundly liberating. They're not proof you're a fraud, but proof you're human. With this foundation, we can begin the work of Chapter 4, retraining our brains to register and believe in our competence as readily as it currently fixates on perceived inadequacies. The journey from imposter syndrome to authentic confidence starts with recognizing that the voice in your head telling you don't belong here isn't speaking truth. It's recycling old survival mechanisms that no longer serve you in your current environment and accomplishments. Chapter 4. Spotting your inner critic. The first step to silencing it, the inner critic represents perhaps the most insidious and persistent manifestation of imposter syndrome, functioning as a relentless internal narrator that systematically undermines your confidence by transforming ordinary challenges into evidence of fundamental inadequacy. This psychological phenomenon operates through a series of automatic negative thoughts that arise in response to professional or personal challenges, presenting themselves as undeniable truths despite being profoundly distorted reflections of reality. The inner critic's power stems from its ability to mimic rational self-assessment while actually engaging in extreme and irrational cognitive distortions that would never be applied to others. Research in cognitive psychology demonstrates that this critical inner voice typically originates from early life experiences where conditional approval was tied to achievement, leading individuals to develop maladaptive thought patterns that equate self-worth with flawless performance. Neuroscientific studies utilizing fMRI technology reveal that self-critical thoughts activate the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, brain regions associated with processing physical pain, which explains why imposter syndrome creates such visceral discomfort even when intellectually we recognize our accomplishments. The inner critic specializes in what psychologists call thought-action fusion, where simply imagining failure creates the same physiological stress response as actual failure, trapping individuals in cycles of anticipatory anxiety that can persist for decades without intervention. This internal voice employs specific rhetorical tactics including catastrophizing minor setbacks, that typo in your report proves you're incompetent, personalizing external events, the meeting was canceled because they don't value your input, and engaging in fortune-telling, you'll definitely fail at this new project. These patterns become self-reinforcing through confirmation bias, as the brain selectively attends to experiences that validate the critical narrative while filtering out contradictory evidence. The development of the inner critic follows predictable psychological pathways, often beginning in childhood environments where love or approval was perceived as contingent upon perfect performance. Educational systems that emphasize standardized testing and normative comparisons further entrench these patterns by teaching young minds to measure worth through external validation rather than internal growth. In adulthood, workplace cultures that prioritize flawless execution over learning compound the problem, creating environments where the inner critic flourishes. The digital age has introduced new dimensions to this phenomenon, with social media platforms providing endless opportunities for unfavorable upward comparisons against curated versions of others' lives and careers. What makes the inner critic particularly damaging is its ability to disguise itself as helpful motivation. Many high achievers mistakenly believe their self-criticism drives their success, failing to recognize how much it limits their potential and well-being. Cognitive behavioral therapy research has identified several characteristic thinking errors employed by the inner critic, including dichotomous thinking, viewing outcomes as either perfect or total failures, emotional reasoning, believing feelings reflect objective reality, and mental filtering, focusing exclusively on negative aspects while ignoring positives. These distortions become automatic over time, operating below conscious awareness, while significantly impacting emotional states and decision-making. The inner critic also engages in what psychologists call mind reading, where individuals assume they know others' negative judgments about them without any factual basis. Workplace studies show these patterns are particularly prevalent among high-achieving women and underrepresented minorities, who often face additional layers of stereotype threat in professional environments. Effective strategies for managing the inner critic begin with developing metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe one's own thoughts as mental events rather than absolute truths. Mindfulness practices have demonstrated particular efficacy in creating the psychological distance needed to challenge automatic negative thoughts. Cognitive restructuring techniques teach individuals to identify and dispute irrational self-criticisms by examining evidence for and against the thoughts, considering alternative explanations, and assessing the real rather than imagined consequences of mistakes. Many find it helpful to personify their inner critic as a character with specific traits and motivations, which reduces the identification with critical thoughts and creates space for more balanced self-assessment. Long-term management of the inner critic involves cultivating what psychologist Kristen Neff calls self-compassion, treating oneself with the same kindness and understanding one would offer a struggling friend. This approach has been shown in clinical studies to reduce anxiety and perfectionism while maintaining high standards. Organizational interventions can also help, particularly when leaders model vulnerability by sharing their own experiences with self-doubt and normalizing the universality of these challenges. The ultimate goal isn't to eliminate self-criticism entirely, which could lead to complacency, but rather to transform it into constructive self-evaluation that promotes growth without causing paralysis. As we develop skills to recognize and manage our inner critic, we prepare ourselves for the next crucial stage of overcoming imposter syndrome, actively building authentic confidence through deliberate practice and cognitive restructuring. This foundation makes possible the work we'll explore in Chapter 5, learning to transform our self-talk from a source of limitation to a tool for empowerment. The journey from debilitating self-doubt to healthy self-assessment requires patience and consistent practice, but each step forward weakens the inner critic's hold and strengthens our ability to recognize and claim our rightful achievements. Chapter 5. The transformative power of yet. How a single word can rewire your brain for growth and resilience. At the heart of imposter syndrome lies a fundamental misunderstanding of competence. The false belief that ability should be innate rather than developed, that mastery should precede effort rather than emerge from it. This chapter explores how one of the most powerful antidotes to this destructive thinking is a simple three-letter word. Yet, when added to our self-talk, I don't understand this. Yet, this tiny linguistic shift creates profound psychological changes, transforming our perception of challenges from permanent limitations to temporary phases in an ongoing journey of growth. The concept originates from Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck's seminal research on mindset, which revealed that people who believe their abilities can be developed, a growth mindset, achieve significantly more than those who view intelligence and talent as fixed traits. The power of yet lies in its ability to activate this growth orientation, serving as a linguistic bridge between our current struggles and future capabilities. Neuroscientific research has demonstrated that adopting yet statements creates measurable changes in brain function. Functional MRI studies show that when individuals frame challenges as not yet rather than can't, there's increased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for problem-solving, cognitive flexibility, and goal-directed behavior. Simultaneously, this linguistic shift decreases activity in the amygdala, our brain's threat detection center, reducing the fight-or-flight response that often accompanies learning challenges. These neural changes explain why students and professionals who practice, yet thinking demonstrate greater persistence when facing difficulties. They're literally operating with different brain circuitry than those stuck in fixed mindset patterns. The word functions as a psychological placeholder for future competence, allowing us to tolerate the discomfort of not knowing while maintaining motivation to continue learning and practicing. The true power of yet becomes evident when examining how experts across various fields approach skill development. World-class performers in domains ranging from medicine to music understand that mastery follows a predictable trajectory. What initially feels awkward and effortful gradually becomes automatic through deliberate practice. Olympic athletes, for instance, spend countless hours in the not-yet phase, where their techniques are unpolished and their performance falls far short of their potential. By framing this phase as a necessary part of the journey rather than evidence of inadequacy, they persist through the discomfort that causes others to give up. Research on expertise development shows that the key differentiator between those who achieve elite performance and those who plateau isn't initial talent, but rather their ability to remain motivated and strategic during the extended not yet period before competence emerges. In professional environments, the yet principle has particularly powerful applications. Leaders who model this language, "we haven't solved this problem," yet create psychological safety that encourages innovation and risk-taking within their teams. In creative fields, embracing not yet helps artists and writers persist through the inevitable gap between their vision and their current ability to execute it. The technology sector, where skills become obsolete rapidly, provides compelling examples of yet thinking in action. Successful engineers maintain their edge not by knowing everything, but by being confident in their ability to learn what they don't yet know. Studies of career transitions show that individuals who adopt this mindset adapt more successfully to new roles and industries. viewing the steep learning curve as temporary rather than as evidence they don't belong. The benefits extend beyond professional achievement to personal well-being. Fixed mindset thinking, "I'm just not good at relationships," leads to learned helplessness. Yet framing, "I haven't figured out how to make this relationship work," yet maintains hope and agency. In health behavior change, people who view setbacks as not yet there rather than failures are significantly more likely to eventually succeed. The cumulative effect of these small language shifts is profound. They gradually reshape our identity narrative from someone constrained by limitations to someone who systematically develops capabilities through persistent effort. Implementing the yet principle requires deliberate practice, as our brains default to absolute statements, "I can't do this," that trigger stress responses. Effective strategies include creating environmental cues, post-it reminders saying "add yet," practicing specific yet, reframing during weekly reviews, and consciously modeling this language when mentoring others. Organizational leaders can amplify the impact by normalizing not yet phases during team development and framing ambitious goals as not yet achieved, rather than distant or impossible. Over time, this linguistic practice fosters what psychologist Angela Duckworth terms grit, the combination of passion and perseverance that predicts long-term success across domains. The most profound impact of yet thinking may be its ability to dismantle imposter syndrome at its root. By normalizing the not yet phase as an expected part of the learning process rather than evidence of fraudulence, we undercut the imposter phenomenon's core premise, that competence should be immediate and effortless. This chapter's insights prepare us for Chapter 6's exploration of how to recognize and own our existing strengths, completing the mindset shift from doubt to authentic confidence. The journey from "I can't" to "I can't yet" to ultimately "I can" represents one of the most powerful transformations available to anyone willing to examine and revise their most basic self-talk patterns. Chapter 6. Your strengths are real, even if you don't see them. The blind spot of competence. We arrive now at one of imposter syndrome's most perplexing paradoxes. The better you become at something, the harder it becomes to recognize your own expertise. This phenomenon, known in psychology as the beginner's bubble, explains why true experts often underestimate their abilities while novices frequently overestimate theirs. As skills become automatic through practice, what psychologists call unconscious competence, we lose the ability to see them as special because they feel effortless. Your brain literally forgets how hard-won these abilities were, creating what cognitive scientists call the curse of expertise. This chapter provides the tools to break this curse, helping you develop accurate self-assessment by identifying, owning, and leveraging strengths you've been taking for granted. Neuroscience reveals why recognizing our own strengths proves so challenging. Brain imaging studies show that when performing well-practiced skills, experts demonstrate decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region associated with conscious effort, and increased activity in basal ganglia and cerebellum, where automatic processes reside. This neural efficiency creates subjective feelings of ease that mask the true sophistication of our abilities. Simultaneously, our attention naturally focuses on what still needs improvement, a phenomenon called the deficiency drive that helped our ancestors survive, creating an unbalanced self-assessment. Research in organizational psychology demonstrates that most people can name their weaknesses far more readily than their strengths, with high achievers particularly prone to this imbalance. The resulting strength blindness leaves us vulnerable to imposter feelings when we compare our internal experience of effortlessness with others' polished external presentations. The journey to recognizing your real strengths begins with understanding how expertise develops. The 4 stages of competence model: unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, unconscious competence, reveals why you might feel like an imposter precisely when you're actually becoming skilled. At the unconscious competence stage, your hard-won abilities have become second nature. You can perform them without thinking, which ironically makes them invisible to you. A master chef doesn't consciously recall the thousands of hours that made knife skills automatic. A seasoned professor forgets how terrifying public speaking once was. This explains why you might dismiss compliments about skills that feel easy. You've forgotten they were ever difficult. Studies of expertise show that it takes about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve mastery in most fields. Yet our brains conveniently forget the struggle once we arrive. Cognitive biases further distort our self-perception. The spotlight effect leads us to believe others notice our flaws more than they actually do, while pluralistic ignorance makes us assume everyone else is more confident than they feel. We suffer from comparison neglect, failing to account for how much more we know about our own struggles than others. Perhaps most damaging is the duality error, the false belief that others are naturals, while our own skills are painstakingly acquired. Research shows that nearly 70% of successful people secretly fear being found out, unaware that their peers share the same doubts. These distorted perceptions create what psychologists call the imposter gap, the disparity between how competent you actually are and how competent you feel. The journey to recognizing your real strengths begins with understanding how expertise develops. The 4 stages of competence model: unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, unconscious competence, reveals why you might feel like an imposter precisely when you're actually becoming skilled. At the unconscious competence stage, your hard-won abilities have become second nature. You can perform them without thinking, which ironically makes them invisible to you. A master chef doesn't consciously recall the thousands of hours that made knife skills automatic. A seasoned professor forgets how terrifying public speaking once was. This explains why you might dismiss compliments about skills that feel easy. You've forgotten they were ever difficult. Studies of expertise show that it takes about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve mastery in most fields. Yet our brains conveniently forget the struggle once we arrive. Cognitive biases further distort our self-perception. The spotlight effect leads us to believe others notice our flaws more than they actually do, while pluralistic ignorance makes us assume everyone else is more confident than they feel. We suffer from comparison neglect, failing to account for how much more we know about our own struggles than others. Perhaps most damaging is the duality error, the false belief that others are naturals, while our own skills are painstakingly acquired. Research shows that nearly 70% of successful people secretly fear being found out, unaware that their peers share the same doubts. These distorted perceptions create what psychologists call the imposter gap, the disparity between how competent you actually are and how competent you feel. Practical strategies exist to correct these misperceptions. The reflected best self exercise, developed by University of Michigan researchers, involves collecting specific examples from colleagues, friends, and mentors about when you at your best. Analyzing these patterns reveals strengths you've been overlooking. Another powerful tool is maintaining a mastery journal, where you record 1. Skills that have become effortless and therefore invisible to you. Compliments you've reflexively dismissed. Problems you solve routinely that others find challenging. Knowledge you possess that you once had to consciously acquire. Cognitive restructuring techniques help combat strength blindness. When you think, this is easy, so it doesn't count, ask, would I have found this easy 5 years ago? Could someone without training do this as well? Do I make this look easy because I've mastered it? Organizational psychologist Tomasz Chamorro-Premuzic suggests treating your strengths like financial assets, regularly auditing them, investing in their growth, and leveraging them strategically. This shifts strengths from abstract concepts to tangible tools you consciously deploy. The ultimate goal isn't arrogant self-assurance but accurate self-assessment, recognizing that your capabilities, however uneven, are real and earned. As we'll explore in Chapter 7, this clear-eyed self-knowledge becomes the foundation for authentic confidence that doesn't require constant external validation. By learning to see the strengths you've been overlooking, you take a crucial step towards silencing the imposter narrative for good. Chapter 7, Proof Over Fear, Building Unshakable Confidence Through Evidence-Based Self-Assessment. The human brain possesses an extraordinary ability to disregard overwhelming evidence of our competence while fixating on isolated moments of self-doubt, creating what psychologists call the imposter's paradox. The more objective success we achieve, the more we distrust it. This chapter presents a systematic approach to breaking this destructive pattern by developing what cognitive behavioral therapists term evidence-based thinking, a disciplined practice of allowing facts rather than feelings to shape our self-assessment. At its core, this method recognizes that imposter syndrome thrives in the absence of data, feeding on vague anxieties and hypothetical catastrophes that evaporate under the light of careful examination. By creating what amounts to a psychological balance sheet, where we account for both our capabilities and growth areas with equal rigor, we construct an antidote to the toxic self-doubt that sabotages so many high achievers. Neuroscientific research helps explain why this evidence-based approach proves so effective. Brain imaging studies reveal that when individuals engage in factual recall of past successes, they activate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for rational analysis and emotional regulation, while simultaneously quieting the amygdala's fear response. This neural shift creates what psychologists call cognitive reappraisal, allowing us to reinterpret anxiety-provoking situations through the lens of demonstrated capability rather than imagined inadequacy. The process works because it bypasses our brain's natural negativity bias, the evolutionary adaptation that makes us weigh failures more heavily than successes, by forcing equal attention to positive data points we'd otherwise ignore. Clinical studies of cognitive behavioral therapy for imposter syndrome show that patients who maintain structured records of their accomplishments experience significantly greater reductions in self-doubt than those who rely solely on positive affirmations, proving that confidence built on evidence proves far more durable than confidence conjured through wishful thinking. The practice of evidence-based self-assessment begins with creating what organizational psychologists call a mastery portfolio, a living document that catalogs your skills, achievements, and positive feedback across domains. Unlike traditional resumes that present polished narratives for external audiences, this private inventory serves as an unvarnished repository of proof against which to test imposter thoughts when they arise. Effective mastery portfolios include several key components. 1. A skills matrix tracking competencies at different stages of development. 2. Win log, recording both major accomplishments and small victories. 3. Verbatim praise from credible sources. 4. Before and after comparisons showing growth over time. And 5. Problem-solving examples demonstrating how you've overcome past challenges. The magic of this tool lies in its cumulative nature. Reviewing even 1 or 2 entries may provide limited relief, but systematically adding to and revisiting the portfolio creates what psychologists term retrieval strength, making memories of competence increasingly accessible during moments of doubt. Real-world applications of this approach reveal its transformative power. Consider the case of a senior software engineer who believed she'd been promoted due to luck rather than skill. By compiling evidence including code adoption metrics showing her work supported core systems, peer reviews praising her architectural thinking, and a side-by-side comparison of her first pull request versus her current output, she created an irrefutable case for her technical growth. Similarly, a mid-career academic who feared being exposed as intellectually inadequate documented his publication citations, student evaluations, and conference invitations, evidence that objectively placed him in the top quartile of his field despite his subjective feelings of mediocrity. These examples illustrate the critical distinction between feeling like an imposter and being an imposter. The former is a common psychological experience, while the latter is an empirical question answerable through evidence. The evidence-based approach proves particularly powerful when applied to specific imposter syndrome triggers. Facing a high-stakes presentation? Review past speaking engagements where you succeeded, not perfectly, successfully. Daunted by a promotion? Analyze how you've grown into previous role expansions. Frozen by perfectionism? Examine projects where good enough produced excellent outcomes. This method also helps dismantle what psychologists call the myth of the natural, the false belief that real experts don't struggle. By documenting your own journey from struggle to competence in areas where you now excel. Research shows that maintaining this longitudinal perspective increases what psychologists call self-efficacy, the belief in one's ability to handle future challenges, by providing concrete examples of having done so before. Implementing this strategy requires overcoming several psychological barriers. Our tendency to discount positive experiences that didn't count because demands conscious correction. Treat evidence of your competence with the same respect you'd accord evidence about someone you admire. The common reflex to attribute success to external factors, I had help, the bar was low, must be balanced with acknowledgement of your contribution. Perhaps most challenging, we must resist what psychologists term the humility trap, the mistaken belief that acknowledging strengths constitutes arrogance, rather than the accurate self-assessment necessary for continued growth. As this practice becomes habitual, it creates what cognitive scientists call an upward spiral. Each evidence-based confidence boost makes it easier to take on challenges, which in turn generates more evidence of capability. This prepares us for Chapter 8's exploration of how to reframe failure not as proof of fraudulence, but as data for growth. By grounding our self-concept in demonstrable reality rather than subjective fear, we build the foundation for authentic confidence that withstands both setbacks and success. Chapter 8. Failing forward, transforming setbacks into stepping stones for authentic growth. The fear of failure operates as imposter syndrome's most potent fuel, paralyzing potential with catastrophic fantasies of exposure and humiliation. This chapter dismantles the toxic mythology surrounding failure by revealing how the most accomplished individuals across fields don't merely tolerate mistakes. They systematically extract wisdom from them in a process psychologists call productive failure. At its core, this represents a fundamental reorientation from viewing setbacks as evidence of fraudulence to recognizing them as unavoidable way stations on the path to mastery. Research across cognitive science, organizational psychology, and performance studies converges on a counterintuitive truth. The people who achieve most are often those who fail most frequently, not despite their failures, but because of how they leverage them. Neuroscientific breakthroughs illuminate why this approach proves so transformative. Brain imaging studies demonstrate that when individuals adopt what Stanford psychologist Carol Dweck terms a failure-is-enhancing mindset, they exhibit heightened activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, the neural region responsible for error detection and adaptive learning. This contrasts sharply with the threat response triggered by fixed mindset thinking, where mistakes activate the amygdala's fear circuitry. The critical difference lies in interpretation, viewing failure as informative rather than indictive. Behavioral studies reveal this neurological shift creates measurable advantages. Individuals with learning-oriented failure beliefs recover from setbacks 40% faster, demonstrate greater persistence in challenging tasks, and exhibit more creative problem-solving approaches. These benefits stem from what cognitive scientists call error-related positivity, a neural signal that facilitates course correction when mistakes are framed as growth opportunities rather than existential threats. The mechanics of productive failure become visible when examining how experts across domains process mistakes differently than novices. World-class musicians, for instance, don't make fewer errors during practice sessions. They detect and address them more effectively. Elite athletes spend disproportionate time reviewing game footage to analyze failures with dispassionate curiosity. Groundbreaking scientists maintain failure journals, documenting hypotheses that didn't pan out. What separates these high achievers isn't immunity to error, but rather their disciplined, non-judgmental approach to extracting lessons from missteps. Research on expertise development reveals the paradoxical pattern that early career professionals often experience more intense imposter feelings than true novices precisely because they've developed sufficient skill to recognize their mistakes. A phenomenon psychologists term the intermediate dip in the competence curve. Real-world applications of failing forward principles demonstrate their transformative potential. Consider Pixar's post-mortem process following each film production, where teams systematically analyze what went wrong without personal blame. Or the medical field's morbidity and mortality conferences, where surgeons dissect complications to improve future outcomes. These institutionalized practices normalize failure as inherent to progress, creating psychological safety that fuels innovation. At the individual level, adopting similar reflective practices, like maintaining a lessons learned log or conducting personal project retrospectives, can reshape one's relationship with mistakes. The key lies in shifting from, "What does this say about me?" to "What does this teach me?" A cognitive reframe that transforms failure from identity threat to information source. Cognitive behavioral strategies provide practical tools for implementing this mindset shift. The 3-column exercise proves particularly effective. In the first column, describe a failure factually. In the second, record emotional reactions. In the third, extract specific, actionable lessons. This structure creates psychological distance from the event while ensuring value extraction. Another powerful technique involves distinguishing between good failures, thoughtful attempts that didn't pan out, and bad failures, careless mistakes, a framework that maintains accountability while preventing overgeneralization. Research shows that individuals who practice these differentiation skills develop what psychologists call failure wisdom, the ability to assess setbacks with calibrated precision rather than catastrophic thinking. The societal dimension of failure perception cannot be overlooked. Many organizations inadvertently reinforce imposter syndrome through cultures that punish honest mistakes while rewarding the concealment of struggles. Progressive companies are combating this by instituting failure forums, where employees share professional blunders and lessons learned. Educational innovators are replacing traditional grading with mastery learning systems that allow multiple attempts at demonstrating competence. These systemic changes create environments where the vulnerability inherent to growth isn't weaponized against individuals. On a personal level, curating media intake to include authentic stories of struggle alongside triumph, rather than just highlight reels, helps recalibrate our expectations about the universal role of failure in success. Long-term adoption of failing-forward principles requires confronting deep-seated cultural conditioning that equates mistakes with weakness. The work involves recognizing how childhood educational experiences, where errors meant point deductions rather than learning opportunities, shaped current neural pathways. It demands conscious rejection of the perfectionistic fallacy that excellence requires flawlessness. Most challengingly, it necessitates extending to ourselves the same compassionate understanding we'd offer a struggling protege, recognizing that growth demands missteps. As we internalize these lessons, we prepare for Chapter 9's exploration of how strategic preparation builds authentic confidence. By dismantling failure's false connection to fraudulence, we clear the path for achievement unfettered by the fear of imperfection. Chapter 9, The Confidence of Preparation. How deliberate practice builds unshakable self-belief. The relationship between preparation and confidence forms one of the most reliable antidotes to imposter syndrome, yet remains profoundly misunderstood in our culture of instant gratification and manufactured authenticity. This chapter unveils the psychological alchemy that occurs when we shift from hoping we'll feel ready to knowing we've done the work, a transformation rooted not in blind self-assurance but in the quiet certainty that comes from systematic, research-backed preparation techniques. At its core, this approach recognizes a fundamental truth about human performance. What we interpret as natural confidence in others is nearly always the visible tip of an iceberg of unseen preparation. Studies of elite performers across domains, from Olympic athletes to Nobel-winning scientists to master musicians, reveal startling consistency in their approach to preparation, demonstrating how methodical practice rituals don't just build skill, but fundamentally rewire self-perception. Neuroscience illuminates why preparation proves so powerful in combating imposter feelings. When we engage in what psychologists call deliberate practice, the focused, feedback-driven repetition of specific skills, we stimulate myelin production in the brain, the fatty insulation that makes neural pathways more efficient. This biological process, visible in brain scans of experts, corresponds with the subjective experience of competence becoming more automatic and accessible. Simultaneously, structured preparation activates the prefrontal cortex's cognitive control systems, enhancing what researchers term performance monitoring ability. The capacity to accurately assess one's own capabilities rather than defaulting to imposter syndrome's distorted self-perceptions. This strategy produces what's known as the overlearning effect, where skills become so deeply ingrained that they remain accessible even under extreme stress or self-doubt. Cognitive behavioral research reveals how to structure preparation for maximum confidence-building impact. The 80-20 preparation principle suggests focusing 80% of effort on mastering core competencies that drive 80% of results, rather than spreading energy thin trying to cover every contingency. The progressive exposure method involves gradually increasing the stakes of practice scenarios from solo rehearsal to small friendly audiences to larger, more critical groups, to systematically desensitize performance anxiety. Perhaps most counterintuitively, the premortem technique has practitioners imagine their future failure and work backward to identify preventable causes, an approach shown in organizational studies to improve outcomes by 30% compared to traditional planning. These methods share a common thread. They transform preparation from passive review to active skill building, creating neural pathways that bypass imposter syndrome's paralyzing self-talk. The psychological benefits of rigorous preparation extend far beyond performance enhancement. Neuroscientific studies show that structured practice routines reduce activity in the brain's default mode network, the region responsible for self-referential thinking and worry. This explains why well-prepared individuals often report entering flow states during challenging situations, while underprepared counterparts remain trapped in self-conscious anxiety. On a behavioral level, preparation builds what psychologists term response confidence, the certainty that you possess multiple strategies for handling whatever arises, preventing the helplessness that fuels imposter feelings. Perhaps most profoundly, the cumulative effect of preparation is what sports psychologists call earned security, the deep, non-negotiable knowledge that you've done everything possible to succeed, regardless of external validation. Implementing these principles requires overcoming several cultural myths about talent and effort. The pervasive natural genius narrative leads many to interpret their preparation needs as evidence of inadequacy rather than the universal path to mastery. The false dichotomy between hard workers and gifted stars ignores that all sustained achievement requires both. Most insidiously, our celebration of effortless-seeming performance creates the illusion that true competence shouldn't require visible effort. Breaking free from these misconceptions allows us to embrace preparation not as a necessary evil, but as the very process through which confidence becomes earned rather than feigned. As we internalize these lessons, we prepare for Chapter 10's exploration of how to bridge the gap between preparation and performance through what psychologists call legitimate confidence. By recognizing that authentic self-assurance stems not from innate gifts, but from demonstrable readiness, we dismantle one of imposter syndrome's most persistent myths, that real experts don't need to prepare. The ritual of preparation becomes not just a means to an end, but the foundation of an identity rooted in growth rather than pretense. Chapter 10. Fake it till you make it. The right way. The neuroscience of authentic self-projection. The popular admonition to fake it till you make it contains both profound wisdom and dangerous oversimplification. This chapter unravels the neuroscience behind why certain types of strategic self-projection accelerate genuine confidence development while others reinforce imposter syndrome's toxic cycles. At its core, we explore the psychological distinction between harmful pretense, claiming unearned expertise, and beneficial as-if behaviors, adopting the mannerisms of the professional you're becoming, with research revealing how the latter creates neurological pathways that literally build competence from the outside in. Harvard psychologist Amy Cuddy's seminal work on power poses illuminates this phenomenon. When individuals physically embody confidence through posture and presence, they experience measurable increases in testosterone, the dominance hormone, and decreases in cortisol, the stress hormone, creating biochemical changes that precede rather than follow psychological shifts. This embodied cognition effect explains why certain types of strategic self-projection don't merely simulate confidence, but actually cultivate it through what behavioral scientists call self-perception theory. We derive our self-concept in part by observing our own actions and inferring this must be who I am. The neurobiological mechanisms underlying this process reveal why it works. When we engage in what psychologists term costume confidence, adopting the speech patterns, body language, and decision-making habits of the professional we aspire to become, we stimulate mirror neuron systems that help internalize these behaviors as authentic expressions. Functional MRI studies show that practicing confident behaviors activates the same neural networks as genuine confidence, creating what neurologists call experience-dependent neuroplasticity. The brain literally rewires itself based on performed actions, not just internal states. This explains the counterintuitive finding that individuals who strategically project confidence in areas where they possess basic competence, but lack self-assurance, often outperform equally skilled peers who wait to feel ready. Their behavioral experiments create self-reinforcing cycles of positive feedback that accelerate skill integration. The critical boundary lies in what organizational psychologists call the competence threshold, the minimum skill level required for ethical self-projection, with research showing this approach backfires when attempted without foundational capabilities, but proves transformative when bridging the gap between existing skills and unrecognized potential. Real-world applications demonstrate how to implement this strategy without veering into harmful imposture. Medical residents trained in as-if communication techniques, speaking with authority when discussing diagnoses they verified but lack clinical experience with, show significantly better patient outcomes than peers who qualify every statement. Not because they know more, but because their confident delivery improves information retention and compliance. Junior executives who practice decisive meeting behaviors, speaking first, summarizing discussions, proposing action steps, gain disproportionate influence regardless of formal rank, creating leadership opportunities that then develop actual leadership skills. The common thread is what psychologists call legitimate peripheral participation, engaging authentically with aspects of a role within one's current capabilities while strategically stretching at the edges, rather than the reckless bluffing often associated with faking it. Cognitive science provides frameworks for ethical implementation. The 10% stretch principle suggests projecting confidence just slightly beyond current comfort zones, enough to grow but not so far as to feel fraudulent. The competence anchoring method involves consciously tethering projected confidence to specific, verifiable skills. I may not know everything about marketing, but I'm an expert in customer segmentation because, perhaps most importantly, the preparation projection loop creates virtuous cycles where strategic confidence behaviors lead to new performance opportunities that then demand and inspire actual skill development. what psychologists term behavioral activation of latent potential. The psychological benefits extend beyond professional advancement. Studies in social anxiety treatment show that individuals who practice as if social behaviors, initiating conversations, maintaining eye contact, not only reduce avoidance patterns, but actually experience neural changes that decrease baseline anxiety over time. Similarly, research on stereotype threat demonstrates that members of underrepresented groups who briefly embody successful role models before challenging tasks significantly improve performance by short-circuiting self-doubt cycles. These findings reveal that strategic self-projection works not by creating false selves, but by allowing suppressed capabilities to emerge, what humanistic psychologists call becoming who you are by trying on possibilities. Long-term integration requires navigating several pitfalls. The illusion of transparency, the false belief that our insecurities are visibly obvious to others, must be overcome to avoid excessive self-monitoring that undercuts natural presence. The pretense exhaustion phenomenon, the mental fatigue of maintaining unsustainable facades, demands honest self-assessment about competence thresholds. Most crucially, the approach requires balancing projected confidence with what psychologist Carl Weick terms small wins, concrete achievements that gradually close the gap between projected and actual self-concept. As we master these nuances, we prepare for Chapter 11's exploration of how vulnerability and help-seeking, far from undermining confidence, complete its development. By understanding that authentic professional identity emerges through alternating cycles of stretching and consolidation, we transcend the false choice between fraud and expert, occupying instead the dynamic middle ground where growth thrives. Chapter 11, The Genius of Collaboration, How Strategic Help-Seeking Shatters Imposter Myths. The stubborn belief that real experts don't need help stands as one of imposter syndrome's most damaging illusions, isolating sufferers in self-imposed silos of unnecessary struggle. This chapter dismantles that fallacy by revealing how the world's most accomplished individuals, from Nobel laureates to Fortune 500 CEOs, actively cultivate what organizational psychologists term strategic dependence networks. Far from indicating weakness, the conscious curation of expert support systems represents a sophisticated professional skill that accelerates growth, mitigates blind spots, and ultimately distinguishes adequate performers from exceptional ones. Research across high-stakes fields, medicine, aerospace, elite athletics, demonstrates that top performers seek input and assistance at significantly higher rates than their mid-tier counterparts, precisely because their advanced understanding reveals the complexity of problems and value of collective intelligence. The uncomfortable truth is this: what imposters interpret as personal deficiency, "I shouldn't need help with this," often signals the exact opposite, the professional maturity to recognize when collaboration creates superior outcomes. Neuroscientific insights explain why help-seeking proves so psychologically challenging despite its professional benefits. Brain imaging studies reveal that requests for assistance activate the anterior cingulate cortex and insula, regions associated with social pain and threat detection, with intensity comparable to physical discomfort. This neural response stems from evolutionary wiring that equated vulnerability with survival risk in our ancestral past. However, contemporary workplace studies show a fascinating counterphenomenon. When individuals overcome this barrier and seek help appropriately, their brains release oxytocin and dopamine, chemicals associated with social bonding and reward, creating what psychologists term the collaboration high. This biochemical shift explains why professionals who regularly engage in strategic help-seeking report higher job satisfaction and faster skill acquisition than solitary strugglers. The paradox lies in our simultaneous neural wiring to fear asking for help, yet benefit profoundly from doing so, a tension resolved only through deliberate practice in vulnerability. The mechanics of effective help-seeking reveal why it's a skill to be honed rather than a concession to failure. MIT's research on help literacy identifies 4 key dimensions: diagnostic precision, articulating exactly what kind of help is needed; targeted outreach, selecting optimal helpers for specific needs; reciprocity cultivation, building mutual support ecosystems; and help process design, structuring assistance for maximum efficiency. High performers distinguish themselves not by needing less help, but by requesting it more effectively. They bring partially completed work rather than blank slates, propose specific questions rather than general confusion, And always clarify desired input types. Am I seeking information, feedback, or collaboration? This precision transforms help seeking from a confidence drain to a confidence builder, as each interaction provides calibrated skill enhancement rather than vague reassurance. Real-world examples illuminate this principle in action. Surgeons participating in operative coaching programs, where seasoned practitioners observe and advise peers, reduce complication rates by 23% while reporting increased confidence. Silicon Valley's most successful founders maintain personal boards of directors, small groups of mentors who provide targeted guidance on different business functions. Even elite special forces units institutionalize after-action reviews, where decorated veterans dissect missions to extract lessons, proving that not even the most highly trained professionals consider themselves beyond improvement. These examples share a common thread: the understanding that expertise isn't a solitary achievement, but a collective process, and that the mark of true confidence isn't self-sufficiency, but discernment in leveraging others' strengths. Cognitive strategies help overcome psychological barriers to help-seeking. The 5-minute rule. If stuck longer than 5 minutes on a solvable problem, you're obligated to seek help. Prevents unnecessary floundering while preserving productive struggle. They help journal, technique documents assistance given and received, revealing the reciprocal nature of professional growth, and combating the imposter's fallacy of being the only one who needs support. Perhaps most powerfully, the mentor-mirror exercise involves reflecting on how you'd advise a protege facing your exact challenge, then following that advice yourself. A method that bypasses self-critical blind spots by leveraging your innate wisdom as an outsider. The organizational dimension proves equally crucial. Companies combating imposter syndrome at scale implement vulnerability normalization programs where leaders model help-seeking behaviors publicly. Some tech firms have instituted help-wanted boards where employees post specific skill gaps colleagues can assist with, transforming private shame into collaborative opportunities. Progressive academic labs conduct failure conferences where researchers share dead-end experiments, reinforcing that unanswered questions drive science as much as breakthroughs. These systemic interventions create cultures where admitting limits becomes a professional strength rather than a career risk, precisely the environment where imposters can shed their defensive self-sufficiency. Long-term adoption requires confronting deep-seated cultural myths about individualism and meritocracy. The pervasive self-made narrative ignores how all substantial achievement rests on accumulated knowledge and support systems. The false dichotomy between leaders and followers obscures how effective leadership increasingly means curating diverse expertise rather than personally possessing it. Most insidiously, our educational systems often punish collaboration as cheating, creating lifelong associations between help-seeking and inadequacy. Recognizing these cultural distortions allows professionals to reframe strategic dependence not as weakness, but as sophisticated resource management, the ability to marshal all available assets toward meaningful goals. As we master these principles, we prepare for Chapter 12's exploration of how small wins create compound confidence. By recognizing that even the most admired professionals operate within webs of mutual support, we dismantle the imposter's destructive fantasy of solitary genius, freeing ourselves to achieve more through connection than we ever could through isolated striving. Chapter 12. The Compound Effect of Small Wins. How micro-victories build macro-confidence. The human brain is wired to overlook gradual progress while fixating on unmet goals, a neurological bias that fuels imposter syndrome by obscuring tangible evidence of growth. This chapter illuminates the transformative power of small wins, demonstrating how systematic recognition of incremental achievements creates what positive psychologists call success spirals, self-reinforcing cycles where each acknowledged victory builds confidence for subsequent challenges. Research across organizational behavior, neuroscience, and performance psychology converges on a counterintuitive truth. The people who sustain the highest levels of achievement aren't those who wait for monumental breakthroughs, but those who cultivate daily rituals of recognizing and building upon minor advancements. A 10-year longitudinal study of professionals across industries revealed that individuals who maintained small wins journals showed 37% greater career progression than matched peers, not because they accomplished more initially, but because their heightened awareness of progress fueled persistent effort and risk-taking. Neuroscience reveals why this practice proves so potent. Each time we consciously recognize an accomplishment, no matter how small, our brains release dopamine, a neurotransmitter that serves dual functions: it provides immediate satisfaction while motivating pursuit of future rewards. This biochemical mechanism, rooted in our evolutionary drive for incremental improvement, creates what neurologists term success-induced neuroplasticity, the phenomenon where celebrating small wins literally rewires neural pathways to associate effort with reward. Functional MRI studies show that individuals who practice regular progress tracking develop enhanced connectivity between the basal ganglia, responsible for habit formation, and prefrontal cortex, governing goal-directed behavior. This neural integration explains why small wins practitioners demonstrate greater resilience. Their brains have learned to derive motivation from the process of growth rather than relying solely on infrequent major achievements. The psychology of small wins operates through several distinct mechanisms. First, it combats what psychologists call destination fallacy, the mistaken belief that confidence will magically appear upon reaching some future milestone. By focusing on present-moment progress, we develop what Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura termed self-efficacy, the belief in our capacity to execute tasks, which proves far more predictive of success than abstract self-esteem. Second, small wins provide what behavioral economists call proof points, concrete data that counters imposter syndrome's vague anxieties. When the inner critic whispers, "You're not making progress," a log of recent accomplishments offers irrefutable counter-evidence. Third, this practice leverages what organizational theorists name the progress principle, the consistent finding that the single most powerful workplace motivator isn't praise or compensation, but the sense of moving forward in meaningful work. Real-world applications demonstrate the remarkable cumulative power of small wins. Consider the 1% improvement method employed by Olympic coaches. Rather than focusing on medal targets, athletes track daily micro-improvements in specific skills, a 1% better start time, a slightly smoother technique. Over months, these increments compound into transformative growth. In corporate settings, agile development teams use sprint retrospectives to highlight what worked in each short work cycle, maintaining momentum through constant recognition of forward motion. Even in personal growth, research shows that dieters who celebrate every 5 pounds lost maintain motivation longer than those fixated solely on their ultimate goal weight. These examples reveal a universal principle. Sustainable achievement comes not from occasional leaps, but from the daily discipline of recognizing and building upon small advancements. Practical implementation requires overcoming several cognitive barriers. Our brain's negativity bias causes small setbacks to loom larger than small victories, an evolutionary holdover that once kept us alert to threats but now distorts self-assessment. The hindsight fallacy leads us to discount past struggles once they're overcome, making current skills appear always easy rather than hard-won. Perhaps most insidiously, the comparison distortion has us measuring our raw footage against others' highlight reels. Combating these tendencies demands deliberate strategies. Maintaining a progress portfolio with concrete examples of growth, scheduling weekly win reviews, and creating visual progress indicators like skill thermometers or competency matrices that make improvement tangible. Cognitive behavioral techniques enhance small wins' impact. The if-then planning method links specific achievements with predetermined celebrations. If I complete this draft section, then I'll take a walk in the park. The progress sandwich structures reflection sessions to note. 1. What's improved since last check-in? 2. Current challenges. And 3. Next small steps. Most powerfully, the skill chain technique visualizes competencies as interconnected links, where mastering one small element provides the foundation for the next, making visible how today's modest gains enable tomorrow's larger accomplishments. Organizational applications multiply these benefits. Companies that institute small wins sharing in team meetings see 28% higher innovation rates. Schools that emphasize progress over perfection produce students with greater intrinsic motivation. Even families that implement daily win rituals at dinner report higher collective resilience. Chapter 13. Becoming your own best ally. The transformative power of self-advocacy. The journey from imposter syndrome to authentic confidence culminates in a fundamental reorientation of our inner dialogue. From self-sabotage to strategic self-support. This chapter explores the psychological architecture of self-advocacy, revealing how the deliberate cultivation of an inner champion serves as the ultimate counterweight to the inner critic's corrosive narratives. Grounded in decades of research on self-compassion and cognitive restructuring, This approach moves beyond merely silencing negative self-talk to actively constructing what positive psychologists call a growth-oriented inner ecosystem. At its core lies a radical proposition that the most powerful professional development tool isn't another skill-building technique, but the systematic rewiring of how we relate to ourselves during challenges. Studies of high performers across domains show that while technical abilities determine entry-level success, long-term achievement depends increasingly on what organizational psychologists term self-leadership, the ability to motivate, guide, and advocate for oneself with the same skill we'd extend to a valued colleague or protege. Neuroscientific breakthroughs illuminate why self-advocacy proves so transformative. Brain imaging studies reveal that when individuals practice self-supportive thinking, they activate the left prefrontal cortex, the region associated with positive affect and resilience, while quieting the amygdala's threat response. This neural shift creates what researchers call an upward spiral of emotional and cognitive functioning, where each self-supportive act makes subsequent positive responses more automatic. The practice of self-advocacy operates through several interlocking mechanisms. First, it provides what psychologist Kristen Neff terms emotional homeostasis, the ability to stabilize oneself during setbacks without excessive reliance on external validation. Second, it builds psychological capital, the internal reserves that allow professionals to persist through challenges that would overwhelm those dependent on constant reassurance. Third, and perhaps most crucially, it fosters what organizational theorists call authentic self-expression, the capacity to bring one's full capabilities to bear without the distorting filters of self-doubt. This trifecta of benefits explains why professionals who master self-advocacy consistently outperform equally talented peers who remain trapped in cycles of self-questioning. They allocate mental energy toward growth rather than self-protection. Real-world applications demonstrate self-advocacy's transformative potential. Consider the inner board of directors exercise used at Harvard Business School, where executives identify and cultivate different supportive inner voices, the coach, the advocate, the realist, to provide balanced self-guidance. Or the failure resume practice pioneered at Stanford, where professionals document setbacks alongside lessons learned, reframing mistakes as credentials and resilience. Even in high-stakes environments like emergency medicine, practitioners now train in self-debriefing techniques that balance critical analysis with intentional recognition of what went well. These approaches share a common thread. They reject the false choice between self-criticism and self-delusion, instead cultivating clear-eyed self-support that acknowledges both strengths and growth areas without either diminishing or exaggerating them. Cognitive behavioral strategies provide practical tools for building self-advocacy skills. The best possible self-intervention involves vividly imagining future success scenarios, which research shows increases optimism and goal persistence. The self-advocacy matrix helps identify situations where one typically abandons self-support public speaking, negotiating promotions, and develops tailored affirmations grounded in demonstrable competencies. Perhaps most powerfully, the ally versus critic dialogue exercise creates psychological distance from negative self-talk by literally writing out both voices' perspectives, then authoring a supportive response the way one would advise a cherished friend. These techniques work because they engage what psychologists call the observing self, the part of consciousness that can witness thoughts without being consumed by them. The organizational implications are profound. Companies combating imposter syndrome at scale are implementing self-advocacy training that teaches employees to articulate their value without apology, not as bragging, but as crucial information flow. Some forward-thinking firms have replaced traditional self-evaluations with accomplishment audits that shift focus from justifying one's role to strategically planning one's growth. Even academic institutions are experimenting with failure CVs that normalize professional stumbles as part of intellectual growth. These systemic changes create cultures where self-advocacy becomes recognized not as narcissism but as professional responsibility, the obligation to ensure one's full capabilities can be deployed where they're most needed. Long-term mastery requires confronting deep cultural conditioning that equates self-advocacy with selfishness. Many professionals, particularly women and members of collectivist cultures, internalize early messages that valuing oneself constitutes arrogance. The path forward involves recognizing that authentic self-support isn't the opposite of humility. It's the foundation for sustainable contribution. As we become better allies to ourselves, we paradoxically become more present for others, freed from the exhausting performance of having it all together. This journey of self-advocacy prepares us for Chapter 14's exploration of how to pay these insights forward. Having learned to extend to ourselves the support we'd readily offer others, we're now equipped to help dismantle imposter syndrome, not just in our own lives, but in our teams, organizations, and communities, transforming professional cultures from the inside out. Chapter 14, The Confident Person's Mindset, Decoding the Cognitive Architecture of Authentic Self-Assurance. True confidence, when examined at its psychological roots, bears little resemblance to the brash caricatures of popular imagination. It is not the absence of doubt, but rather a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty. This chapter dissects the thought patterns and metacognitive strategies that distinguish authentically confident individuals from those perpetually trapped in imposter syndrome cycles, revealing how subtle shifts in self-perception create dramatic differences in professional presence and performance. Drawing on longitudinal studies of leaders across sectors, cognitive research on decision-making under uncertainty, and clinical findings about resilience, we uncover that genuinely secure professionals share several counterintuitive mental frameworks. They view competence as contextual rather than absolute, interpret gaps in knowledge as inevitable rather than shameful, and approach challenges with what psychologist Carl White terms small win strategies that make progress tangible. Unlike the imposter's binary thinking that categorizes outcomes as either validation or exposure, the confident mindset operates in probabilities and gradients, recognizing that most professional endeavors involve partial understanding and incremental mastery, and that this reality constitutes neither personal failing nor professional disqualification. Neuroscientific investigations into the confident brain reveal surprising findings that overturn conventional wisdom. Advanced imaging studies demonstrate that individuals scoring high on authentic confidence measures actually show greater activation in error detection regions like the anterior cingulate cortex when making mistakes, not less, as might be assumed. This suggests that true confidence stems not from obliviousness to errors, but from sophisticated error monitoring systems that facilitate rapid course correction without catastrophic thinking. Simultaneously, these individuals exhibit stronger connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, and the hippocampus, involved in memory recall, enabling them to contextualize current challenges within a broader narrative of past growth and future development. Perhaps most intriguingly, their neural responses to positive and negative feedback show more balanced activation patterns. They derive useful information from both success and setback experiences without overweighting either, creating what psychologists call integrated self-assessment. This neural profile explains why authentically confident professionals can acknowledge limitations without self-stigmatization and accept praise without reflexive dismissal. Their brains process evaluative information as data rather than existential threat. The cognitive habits of genuinely confident individuals cluster around several key principles that can be systematically cultivated. First, they maintain what psychologist Carol Dweck calls a growth portfolio, an evolving inventory of developing competencies that replaces the imposter's all-or-nothing competence assessments. Second, they practice selective perfectionism, distinguishing between areas requiring precision, e. surgical techniques, and those where good enough suffices, e. routine emails, avoiding the exhaustion of total perfectionism. Third, they employ horizon thinking, locating current challenges within longer developmental arcs that normalize struggle phases. Fourth, and perhaps most critically, they demonstrate what organizational psychologists term metaconfidence, confidence in their ability to gain needed competencies over time, which proves far more adaptable than rigid domain-specific assurance. These mental frameworks don't eliminate uncertainty, but they transform it from a source of paralysis into a navigable professional condition. Real-world manifestations of this mindset appear across high-stakes professions. Elite athletes' pre-performance routines focus not on guaranteeing outcomes, but on executing process elements within their control. Seasoned trial attorneys distinguish between case confidence, belief in a particular argument, and courtroom confidence, trust in their ability to think on their feet regardless of case specifics. Emergency room physicians maintain situational awareness confidence, the capacity to assess and respond to evolving crises without needing pre-existing playbooks for every scenario. These examples reveal that authentic confidence resides not in knowing everything, but in knowing how to know what's needed, a distinction that liberates professionals from the imposter's impossible burden of omniscience. Practical cultivation of this mindset involves several research-backed strategies. The competence mapping exercise helps identify areas of core proficiency, active development, and acceptable limitation, creating a balanced skills portrait that counters imposter thinking's distortions. The confidence resume documents not just achievements, but instances of overcoming doubt, building a personal history of resilience. Perhaps most powerfully, the as-if experimentation technique encourages trying on confident behaviors in low-stakes scenarios, leveraging the brain's neuroplasticity to rewire self-perception through action. These practices work because they engage what psychologists call the doing-knowing-being cycle. We build confidence not by waiting to feel it, but by acting from it in ways that generate confirming experiences. Organizational applications of these principles are transforming workplace cultures. Progressive companies now incorporate confidence-building KPIs alongside traditional performance metrics, tracking factors like willingness to take on stretch assignments or frequency of constructive challenge to superiors. Some tech firms have instituted failure postmortems that analyze setbacks for learning value rather than blame. Leadership programs increasingly teach confidence scaffolding, the art of structuring team environments where calculated risk-taking receives support regardless of outcome. These systemic interventions recognize that confidence emerges not just from individual effort, but from organizational ecosystems that normalize the universal struggles of professional growth. The societal implications of this understanding are profound. In educational systems, it suggests replacing high-stakes testing with iterative competency demonstrations that build legitimate mastery. In professional training, it argues for replacing fake it till you make it with learn it, own it, extend it developmental models. Perhaps most importantly, in personal growth, it offers liberation from the exhausting pretense of effortless perfection, replacing it with the energizing challenge of authentic, incremental becoming. As we internalize these lessons, we arrive at our final chapter's exploration of how to extend this hard-won wisdom outward, transforming from recipients of insight to guides for others, beginning their own journeys from doubt to authentic assurance. The confident mindset, it turns out, reaches its fullest expression not in solitary achievement, but in the generative act of lighting the way for those who follow. Chapter 15. Passing the Torch, Transforming Personal Growth into Collective Empowerment. The journey from self-doubt to self-belief reaches its fullest expression when it transcends personal transformation to become a gift we offer others. This final chapter explores how those who have navigated imposter syndrome can serve as guides for others beginning the same passage. What begins as an intensely private struggle against internal voices of inadequacy ultimately blossoms into one of the most powerful forms of leadership, the ability to create psychological safety where growth can flourish. Research across organizational psychology, education, and mentorship studies demonstrates that individuals who articulate their journeys with vulnerability and specificity, sharing not just triumphs but the concrete strategies that bridged moments of doubt, become what sociologists term possibility models, living proof that imposter feelings can be overcome without waiting for some mythical moment of perfect confidence. The neuroscience of social learning reveals why this approach proves so potent. When we witness someone we respect discuss their struggles and coping mechanisms, our mirror neurons fire in patterns that help internalize those same adaptive strategies, creating what psychologists call vicarious resilience. This explains why organizations with leaders who openly share their imposter experiences develop 42% higher innovation rates than those maintaining traditional facades of infallibility. Not because the leaders are more skilled, but because their vulnerability gives permission for others to take the risks that drive progress. The act of mentoring others through self-doubt creates a powerful positive feedback loop that reinforces the mentor's own hard-won confidence. Cognitive science shows that when we articulate strategies to help others, we strengthen those neural pathways in our own brains through what's known as the protégé effect, the phenomenon where teaching material enhances the teacher's mastery. Functional MRI studies reveal that the brain regions activated when offering advice overlap significantly with those governing self-perception, meaning that each time we guide someone through their imposter feelings, we unconsciously reinforce those solutions in our own psychological framework. This neural mechanism explains why professionals who mentor others consistently report stronger self-assurance than peers who focus solely on their individual achievement. The very act of scaffolding someone else's growth rebuilds our own self-concept on more secure foundations. Furthermore, longitudinal studies of mentorship relationships demonstrate that the benefits flow both directions. Mentors gain fresh perspectives that prevent competency complacency, while mints receive roadmaps through territory their guides have already navigated. Effective imposter syndrome mentorship requires specific techniques that differ from traditional skills coaching. The narrative reconstruction approach involves helping others reframe their professional stories to highlight agency and growth, not by dismissing struggles, but by illuminating how each challenge developed crucial capacities. The competence spotlighting technique teaches mentors to reflect back others' strengths that have become invisible to them through the curse of expertise. That phenomenon where practice skills feel so natural we forget they were ever learned. Perhaps most powerfully, the failure autopsy transforms setbacks from evidence of fraudulence to investigational opportunities, asking, what exactly happened? What factors were controllable versus uncontrollable? What specific adjustments would improve outcomes next time? These methods work because they replace the imposter's vague, global self-doubts, I'm a fraud, with concrete, addressable questions. How can I improve this specific skill? Real-world applications demonstrate how organizations can institutionalize this pay-it-forward approach. Some professional services firms now incorporate imposter story sharing into onboarding, where senior leaders discuss their early career struggles before introducing their current accomplishments. Tech companies are experimenting with reverse mentoring circles where junior employees coach executives on emerging skills while receiving guidance on overcoming self-doubt, creating mutual vulnerability that levels hierarchical barriers. Even in academic medicine, where the hidden curriculum once demanded an appearance of omniscience, training programs now include near-peer mentoring that normalizes the universal experience of competence gaps during specialization. These systemic interventions recognize that imposter syndrome diminishes not through solitary triumph but through collective normalization, the growing understanding that everyone, at every level, navigate some version of this challenge. Personal strategies for paying growth forward need not be grandiose to prove transformative. Simply using yet in team settings, we haven't solved this. Yet models growth mindset language, publicly praising the effort behind colleagues' achievements. I know how much work went into that, reinforces that success stems from work rather than magic. Sharing specific stories of skill development. Here's how I improved at this when I was learning makes growth processes tangible rather than mysterious. These small acts create what sociologists term emotional contagion, the spread of adaptive attitudes through social networks, building cultures where people feel safe to acknowledge what they don't know while confident in their capacity to learn. The societal implications of this approach are profound. In educational settings, it suggests replacing sink or swim initiation rituals with transparent discussions of the learning curve. In workplace training, it argues for replacing polished success narratives with honest accounts of the stumbles preceding achievements. Perhaps most importantly, in leadership development, it means valuing vulnerability as highly as vision, recognizing that the leaders who most empower others are those who've done the inner work of transforming their own self-doubt into tools for collective growth. As we close this journey, we recognize that overcoming imposter syndrome was never just about quieting our own inner critic. It was about developing the wisdom and generosity to help others quiet theirs. The torch we pass is not one of perfect confidence, but of hard-won self-acceptance, not the absence of doubt, but the skills to navigate it, not the pretense of having arrived, but the courage to keep growing while helping others find their way. In this final act of service, we discover the ultimate truth. Our deepest confidence emerges not when we stand alone at some imagined pinnacle, but when we turn to extend a hand to those following behind us on the path.